Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Henzie Round 2. Adam has been very gracious to support the channel yet again, has made some changes, and we're going to see what we can cut down to improve the deck. But before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping. We've hit 200 subscribers. In terms of YouTube, I think that doesn't sound like much, but to me, it's staggering that 200 people plus are subscribed to this channel. Honestly, that's so cool. Thank you so much, everyone who's shown support, who's commented, who's messaged me, who's sent me their decks, or even if you've just listened to a few, videos in the background. It means so much. Thank you for supporting the channel, and I'm really excited to keep going and seeing where the channel takes us. It's a strange feeling. It feels like just yesterday I started the channel, and I'm really happy with how it's going. But for now, let's take a look at Henzie, and let's take a look what Adam sent us. Adam says, would like help making the last 7 cuts to the list, as well as your opinion on card ratios around ramp, card draw, and removal. Those are some good topics to touch on. They also say that the budget hasn't changed much, and I'm only offering, I think, 1 edition anyway, so the budget will kind of stay the same. We're gonna, beyond just talking about the cuts, there's a few topics I'm gonna use this deck as an example of, that we can talk about some deck building ideas, and definitely talking about ratios and ideas if we have time as well. But before we get any further, this is a good time to say, hey, in the video description, you'll see the newer version of the deck. Adam was very kind to put it into Moxfield. I really do appreciate that. It's a lot easier to take a look at. And if you looked at the previous deck, or if you want to see how the two decks, align, I would open both deck lists, take a look, but honestly, the deck is in a really good position. It is notably at 110 cards, so we do have some cuts to make, but as a whole, it feels a lot more consistent to what it is supposed to be. And so beyond just talking about a few cuts and a few thoughts, we're going to talk about some ideas of what can generally make it better. Also, while you are in the video description looking for this deck list, you'll notice there's a link to the Google form you can fill out if you'd like to send me your own deck. And I'll be honest, these days I'm getting a lot of decks. Thank you so much, everyone, for sending them in, and I will get to them as soon as I can. If, however, you would like Adam here, for my next video to be about the deck that you made, there's a little link down there where you can make a donation to the channel to bring your deck to the front of the queue. And by supporting the channel, you help everything get together. I can use that money to buy equipment or, get some art for the channel or other things that I think would be really helpful. All right, before we get any further, I think it is helpful to just briefly go over Henzie again, but this time I'm going to talk a little more about conceptually what Henzie brings to a deck and not just a first glance kind of look. So, Henzie gives all the creatures in your hand with, all creatures that you can cast, so as long as you can cast them, doesn't matter from where. They have 4 mana or greater, they have Blitz. The Blitz cost is equal to the mana cost, and you can choose to cast that spell for the Blitz cost. If you do, it gains haste, and then when it dies, you draw a card, and then you sacrifice it at the beginning of the end step. And then for each time you've cast Henzie, the Blitz cost costs 1 generic mana less. So what is the idea here, like on a grander or like a more maybe not a grander, but a more nuanced kind of look? What does Henzie represent in a commander kind of environment? And what Henzie represents is a kind of cheat into play, sneak attack, die trigger, ETB, attack and death trigger kind of deck. So we're not really cheating in creatures as much as we'd like to. Their mana cost isn't really being reduced. What we're trying to capitalize on is a commander that allows us to get several common triggers in quick succession. If we look at a perfect example would be a card like down here, where are you? Inferno Titan. Where Inferno Titan is a creature that has both an entered the battlefield and attack trigger. And with Henzie and Blitz, we are representing getting both of those triggers. Now, granted, they're the same trigger, but getting both of those triggers in one turn. And in terms of what that means for most cards is that cards are generally balanced around the idea that you can only trigger these kind of things in a natural successive, method, right? Inferno Titan is meant to be played as, a 6-drop. You get the first trigger, and then on a subsequent turn, you get another trigger. He's supposed to trigger once a turn. And Blitz allows us to get around that by getting both triggers in one turn. Finally, Blitz does come with the additional idea that once we've gotten those triggers that we want, the creature actually dies but replaces itself in our hand by drawing us a card. Now, traditionally, I think especially for lower level players or new Magic players, there's just this idea that, playing to the board and maintaining a board state is kind of integral. It is very important, even in Commander, where having 1 or 2 creatures makes it less likely that you'll be attacked. But it's not the end all and be all. After all, we'll have Henzie, who is a 3/3, and that can stop a lot of low power attacks. But the fact that we don't keep Inferno Titan is really not that important. The fact that we get so many triggers out of it and then draw a card on its demise is really where we want to get ahead in the game. And this kind of method applies to a lot of things. We can see that we have creatures. One that I particularly like here, let me find it, there we go. Daemogoth Woe Eater is a creature that it's an uncommon, and I do love when uncommons are good in Commander, but it is really, really good in the way that it says that, so it has an upkeep sacrifice downside, which we get around because we don't the creature's not going to live until then. And then it has a death trigger, but specifically a sacrifice trigger, which makes each opponent discard a card, you draw a card, and you gain 2 life. So with 1 Blitz, we are avoiding the negative sides of this card and you getting all of the positive sides of the card with an additional card draw and the ability to hit someone in the face for 7. This is the package that Henzie, supports. We are changing the rules on cards in order to make the most of them in exchange of having a permanent board around. We play very heavily with the graveyard, and we play very heavily with cards that like to see this kind of effect happen. But generally, the thing I like the most about Henzie is that we don't need to go all in on a strategy. We get to play kind of a smattering of a bunch of really good cards here. We get to play, as I suggested, Undo Giant effects, which just put lands onto the battlefield, tap, and ramp us. We get to play Slum Reaper effects, where we're just pressuring our opponents, their boards with a sacrificed effect that generally benefits us. We get to play other reanimation, other cheating into play. And then once we get once we get into the higher stuff, we're just playing general good stuff cards where they just have a lot of effects on ETB, and we are benefiting from it. So instead of going all in on a strategy, we get to kind of play them all, and the deck will function better that way. You might have been able to tell by the way I like deck building and the suggestions I make. I am a person that generally thinks that playing strong cards will make a better deck than playing a lot of synergy. I don't think it's universally true. Really good synergetic decks get a lot further than just generically powerful decks, but for a lot of people, those generically powerful decks will be just more accessible, will be easier to play, and just do better. And with that in mind, I think we're generally going to benefit, especially if we're pulling out of a pre-constructed deck and upgrading it. We're going to be happier with a lot of generic power as opposed to going all in a strategy. And I think Adam has done a very, very good job with the upgrades here and the kind of deck that they've built. All right, I have another topic I want to go into before we talk about cuts and we talk about ratios, is the idea of win more. This is something I've been talking about for a few videos here and there, and I think this is kind of a good chance to kind of talk about it a little more, because this deck has some cards that I think are really good examples of this kind of effect. What is win more? A win more card, if you imagine that when we are evaluating any card, we're putting them into quadrants. Is this card good? Like the quadrants are, is this card good when you are ahead? Is this card good when you are neutral? And is this card good when you are behind? Now I said quadrants and I said 3 because there is a hidden 4th one, but we'll get to that in a second. Those are the 3 kind of sections we tend to think about. A card that's good when you're behind is like a board clear. A card that's good when you are ahead is like a combo piece, and a card that's good at neutral is just generically powerful cards, such as like removal or solemn simulacrum, right? Traditionally, when a card is in multiple sections, so a card that is both good when you are behind and when you are ahead, it becomes stronger, right? It becomes like a more powerful card in a deck. So like, removal generally is good when you are behind because it allows you to start, neutralizing, like making, how do I put this? It starts bringing you up to parity by taking out their creatures. It's good in neutral because it gives you a bit of advantage over the person you're neutrally in the game with. And when you're ahead, you can use that removal to take out blockers and go for the win. So generally removal is good in all 3 sections, and it's why it's kind of integral to a lot of kind of decks. But what happens when a card is only good in one section? And what happens when that one section is, this card is only good when you're ahead? Well, that's what we call win more. Now, I'm not going to keep Solemn Simulacrum up because I think I want to find a better example. And I think it's Chainer is going to be one of them. Let's go with Chainer. Chainer's on my list, but I'm going to take a moment to talk about Chainer here. And it's the idea, so Chainer, maybe Chainer's not the best one here, but we're going to go ahead with it. Chainer is a card that really only works when you're already doing the thing that you want, right? What do I mean by that? Well, Chainer is a method to reanimate creatures from your graveyard. And though Chainer also puts cards into your graveyard, traditionally, since you're discarding a card into your graveyard and then you're going to cast it from your graveyard, like that same card, it might as well have been in your hand. He's really there when you already have creatures in your graveyard, right? Now, he does give haste. I don't want to get too much in the weeds of this. He does give haste, but so does Blitz, so we're just going to kind of ignore that. And just look at the fact that his main deal is that he is going to allow you to cast creatures from your graveyard in order to, make up for the fact that they've died. Okay, that makes sense. How does this deck put creatures in its graveyard? Well, you might say, well, Curse, they're going to remove your creatures. That's fair, but you usually have very little control over that. And that doesn't mean that they can't be exiled or bounced into your hand. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to go to the graveyard. So let's ignore the general kind of interactive ability of this because that can always be meddled with, right? So let's talk about how do we, piloting this deck, put creatures into our graveyard? Well, the answer is kind of simple. We blitz them, right? We blitz out our creatures, and then at the end of the turn, they die and go into the graveyard. So what is Chainer representing here? Chainer is representing the ability to reanimate those creatures that we've blitzed before back onto the battlefield. And in fact, as I mentioned before, because Blitz doesn't care where those creatures are being animated from, we can blitz those creatures back out of the graveyard just in exchange for a card in our hand. That's a lot of fun. This is a good card. This is a really good synergy in a deck like this. But notice when we can do this. In order for us to be able to do this, we need to have had our commander out, and we need to have blitzed out a card, and then we can cast Chainer, and then we can cast or blitz out a creature. Do you notice the kind of pattern here? There's a lot of hoops to jump through for sure, but much more importantly, if we are blitzing out creatures, we are doing what our deck is intending to do, right? We are already ahead. This card is good when we are ahead. Now you might say, well, Cursed, what if we just don't have anything else to blitz? We blitz that one thing and we have no other blitz targets. Okay, that's really unlikely. So I don't think that's a really good argument. And then they might say, well, then what if the card that we blitzed is really, really strong? Let's say it is, Inferno Titan, and we really want Inferno Titan again because Inferno Titan is so good. Isn't Chainer there to let us repeatedly cast Inferno Titan? Well, no, not really, because if you cast Inferno Titan, then you're even more ahead. If the card is so strong that you got really far ahead, it's just, what if it wasn't Inferno Titan? What if it was just a ramp card? Are you still going to use Chainer on that instead of using, any other creature to get that effect? I hope I'm kind of convolutedly making my point, and the idea is this. Remember when I said there were 4 quadrants and I gave 3 examples? Well, so we've got cards that are good when you're behind, cards that are good in neutral, cards that are good when you're ahead, and the 4th quadrant that's not always talked about is cards that are good when your commander is out. And in Commander, those cards are specifically very win more. This card doesn't really do much when your commander hasn't already been out. You don't need your commander out in order for Chainer to be good, but you do have needed your commander to have been out at one time. Now, there is a corner case that I guess it's worth mentioning, is that if you have like Sakura Tribe Elder, and that is something that you can use to keep casting with Chainer over and over again, but that's a really, really niche case, and even then you have to have a really bad hand for that to be worthwhile. So that's the idea, right? Is that this deck is somewhat reliant on blitz. A lot of the suggestions I've made are trying to get around that reliance. Ramp especially is kind of important because it allows us to just naturally play those cards that are high mana without using the cost reduction we get from blitz with Henzie. So with that in mind, we should be looking at the cards that are only good after we've blitzed a bunch of creatures, right? And those cards are probably going to be the weakest cards that we have. And there's a few suggestions here as well that I'm going to go into, but that's the general idea for this deck building section I wanted to talk about. Let's keep that in mind. Let's keep that in mind, as those are the kind of cards we want to attack, and those are the kind of cards that we need to be suspicious of, right? Cards that just don't do anything else outside of us doing the thing. Like, something worth considering, though I don't want to cut, we have a bunch of cards here. Like, our enchantment section is really the best example of this. And I haven't marked any of them to be cut because I do want Adam or anyone else, like any deck builders, to keep this in mind. So let's look what we have here. We have Evolutionary Leap. This is a card that sacrifices creatures in order to get the next creature out of our deck into our hand. This is a card I really, really like, specifically in token strategies, because a token is worth less than a card. However, in a deck like this, where sacrifice outlets are really strong, and that we have creatures, our blitz creatures draw us a card, and we're going to die anyways, Evolutionary Leap is really, really good. This makes sense. So let's keep that in mind. Greater Good does a very, very similar thing, right? It sacrifices a creature and draws you cards, and generally, we need those cards to have more than 3 power in order to not be, like, down cards. But if they've been blitzed, they're going to draw us an additional card, putting us even further ahead. And once again, because they're going to die anyway, Greater Good is really good. These two cards are really, really similar. Let's look at another one. Riveteer's Ascendancy says whenever you sacrifice a creature, you may return another creature that's low mana, and you do this once a turn. Once again, this is intended to work with Blitz, and it works really, really well with Blitz, but that's the main intention. Now, once again, this works with Greater Good and our other sacrifice outlets, so I'm not saying remove this card, but it's interesting to note that its primary effect is to work with Blitz, much like the other ones. Oversold Cemetery works really, really well. It says on your upkeep, if you have 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you can return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. How do you get those creatures in the graveyard? Well, you blitz them out. Is this starting to make sense a little bit? We've got, ignoring the other ones, we've got at least 4 cards here in our 4 of 7 of our enchantments that are primarily made to function with Blitz, right? And that they all get a little worse when they are not being used with Blitz. If you play Inferno Titan, you know, just kind of normally, just naturally, you often are probably not going to want to sacrifice that to Greater Good or Evolutionary Leap until, you know, that card is being targeted or you have removed, like, you know, there's situations where if it's going to get removed, then you're going to do it. But you're not just going to, you know, you're not just going to use Evolutionary Leap on Inferno Titan. And if you don't have the mana, you might not be able to do it anyways. So, you know, it gets less good when you are naturally putting the cards out. Something like, once again, Butcher of Malakir is likewise, where it has a very good, you know, neutral ability and you don't want to sacrifice it. In fact, you want to sacrifice other things while it's out. So these cards are good in this deck, but they are selectively good. A lot of them, especially Oversold Cemetery, are only good when you are far ahead and you have been blitzing cards. Now, I'm not saying this so we can just take them out. That's not the purpose here. But I'm just trying to put an idea in your mind of when these cards are good and what we can do to keep them good, right? An idea here is that cards like Oversold Cemetery will benefit a lot if we put some support into it. If we start putting Buried Alive effects, or we start putting you know, draw, discard, rummage, or looting effects that allow us to just put more and more of our cards into our graveyard. And we're gonna, this is 70 cents. This is a really good card, by the way. I want to be clear. I'm not saying this like it's a bad card. This is a fantastic card. But we just have to be kind of aware of how the synergy of a card like this is set up in a deck like ours, right? Because what this actually reads is draw a card at the beginning of your upkeep for 2 mana. This is almost Dark Confidant, but it's not even on a creature, so it survives board clears. You know, the cost of a card like this is you need to set up your graveyard to constantly be able to draw cards from it, right? You need enough creatures. So I guess it's just important for us to be aware of that, right? And think of that as we go into cards, card selection. Okay, so I think I've talked your ears off about that. Let's talk about cuts. I've instead of usually just doing the additions that I slide in here, I've actually put the cuts here, so it's going to be kind of fun to look through them. But I do have one addition that I think is worth talking about, and it's a new card called Blossoming Tortoise. You know, last time we talked, yesterday I guess, I was talking a lot about creatures that were 4 mana and were putting in lands into play. And then earlier in this video, I've talked already about the idea of how the way Blitz works is allow us to get, you know, more triggers than we're supposed to be able to do. Blossoming Tortoise is like this wonderful mix of solving so many problems that I've been talking about in this video, right? First of all, it's 4 mana, so we can blitz it. Second of all, it has both a battlefield, an ETB, and an attack trigger, which means you get both of them when he has haste, or they have haste. And then what this does is you mill 3 cards, which fills up our graveyard, which is something I've mentioned a few times, and then it returns a land card from your battlefield, from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. I think this is really, really, really good. It's a bit pricey right now because it's a mythic coming out in a new set. I don't know to what degree it's going to hold that price. So $8 American might be putting you over budget, but it's something I think is a really, really powerful card in a Blitz deck. And so I do really recommend it. Unfortunately, all I can say is you're going to have to play with your budget a little. I know that sucks, but I think it's a strong enough card because by itself, it already does something really, really good that if you don't blitz it, you're really happy. And if you do blitz it, that's like ramping 2 cards, drawing a card. It just does so much. I really, really like it. So that is my one addition. Let's go into cards that I'd like to cut. Chainer, I've already talked about it. but I just want to finish it off. Chainer's a really cool card. He's also monetarily very cheap, and I do appreciate that. But unfortunately, he doesn't do a lot in a deck like this. He's very, very fair. And Henzie's Blitz ability is also kind of really fair. Like, you only reduce the mana cost by 1. Chainer doesn't reduce the mana cost at all. It's like a weird reanimation ability that's just for value. And he happens to be just weaker in our deck than anything else, and that if you really want this ability, you're already playing reanimation cards, and I think you'll just be happier to pull those reanimation cards a lot more often than you will, using this. So I think this is an easy cut. Another 4-mana red-black card is Cardur, Doom Scourge. Cardur is neat. I do like Cardur, but excuse me, I don't think this is where he belongs. And there's 2 reasons for this. The first one is Cardur's ability is to force everyone to attack each other. Attack each other if able, which is okay. It's not really important to you. It's kind of a Disrupt Decorum spell, and I do appreciate that Disrupt Decorum would be better at 3 mana and it would draw you a card at the end of the turn. But still, this isn't what your deck is really about, so there's just going to be a lot of times that this card isn't very good, where that first ability isn't really going to do anything, right? Like, that first ability is really strong when the boards are stacked, and it's just okay when your opponents have just a few creatures here and there that they were probably going to attack each other with anyways, right? It does open up their defenses so that you can get some profitable attacks in next turn, but it's just 1 turn, and did you really care if your Blitz creatures were getting blocked anyways? So I don't know. The second thing is that Cardur's second ability is not going to do anything, right? It's going to trigger on his Blitz, and if he dies during combat, or it's not going to trigger at all because he's going to be gone off the battlefield by the time the goad creatures attack each other. And so with that in mind, that second text, you might as well ignore it. So when you put those 2 thoughts together, is that the first text sometimes doesn't apply, and the second text almost always doesn't apply. What you kind of have is a blank red-black creature, and it's just not very good, I would say. This is one of those cards that firmly is very good in a very, very specific scenario, and potentially gets better if you can blink and or reanimate them repeatedly. But that's a lot of work when you have just so many better cards to blitz out, to reanimate. Cardur feels like the stars have to align, and even then, you're not really going to get the full power of this card. So for me, nice and easy cut. If you were looking for where to get the money to budget and allocate Blossom and Tortoise, well, I've got one. How about Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker? Now, this might feel like a bit of a... How do I put this? This might be a bit of a controversial decision. I think Kiki-Jiki is a really, really good card. But if you remember our conversation before, when is Kiki-Jiki good is the question, right? Kiki-Jiki tends to be good when we're already winning, right? We're already putting out creatures that we like, and now we have a 5-mana creature because we don't want to blitz Kiki-Jiki, right? Blitzing Kiki-Jiki is kind of foolish because his entire, the thing that makes him really, really good is that you don't need to blitz him. He just comes out, he stays there, and he just makes copies of your creatures. So we need to play Kiki-Jiki for 5 mana. That's already a lot. And then we need targets. And to be fair, we have a lot of targets, but we need those targets, and we need to have not blitzed those targets. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, if we played Henzie and then we blitz Ondu Giant, we are in a worse position if we play Kiki-Jiki next turn, right? Because then we have nothing to copy. So what that means is we need to just fairly play Ondu Giant, and then we play Kiki-Jiki, and then we get a copy of Ondu Giant, which is fine, but not ideal. Mainly because the cards we really want to use Kiki-Jiki on are in the 6 and 7 mana regions, right? Those cards are just so much better to blitz out, like Inferno Titan, right? Like, sorry, blitz out, to copy with Kiki-Jiki. Like, Inferno Titan is just really good to hit with Kiki-Jiki because of the same reasons it's good to hit with blitz. But do you see what I mean? Like, we need Inferno Titan out. If we have Inferno Titan out, and especially if Inferno Titan is already blitzed, we are already really far ahead, right? What is another Inferno Titan going to do for us? Arguably not much. It's the funny thing is that if you blitz out Inferno Titan and get 2 triggers to do 6 damage as you want, you should probably kill all the creatures that you care about on the board, right? Another 6 damage through another Inferno Titan isn't really doing that much, and that damage is probably going to someone's face. So hitting for, let's say you hit someone with the Inferno Titan, and then you make a copy and you hit them with the second Inferno Titan and you direct all of their damage to that person. That is a total of 18 damage, which is impressive, but not game-winning, right? And then you lose both Inferno Titans unless if you blitz the first one, and now you have to find another card to blitz out to use with Kiki-Jiki. I'm trying to make my argument, but the things I'm saying do sound pretty cool. So it's kind of hard to explain it. But the idea is that Kiki-Jiki is just really good when you're ahead and just kind of terrible when you're behind or generally at neutral. It's very likely that if you play Kiki-Jiki at the wrong time, they're just going to be bolted and you're just going to have spent 5 mana for nothing. So in order to get around that, you're going to want to have your really good creatures already out. And then once again, we're in the situation where if your really good creatures are already out, you're already winning and Kiki-Jiki isn't making you win. It's just making you win more. So all that to say, Kiki-Jiki, they're on my list. I think they're a fantastic Magic card, but this is just not really the deck for them. If you put one of the, I think there's some cards, there has to be a green card that untaps this creature. So you could put it together. I guess there's a red card. You can use our 5 mana steal a creature card. Are you still playing that? Was that in the previous draft and not in this one? I've seen so many decks recently. My brain is kind of going away. There's a 5 mana untap target creature and gain control of it. I can't remember. They're humans with haste. If you play those two, Kiki-Jiki and that together, you go an infinite combo, and that makes a little more sense. But if you're not playing that, honestly, just take out Kiki-Jiki. Speaking of our Nekoru Queen, that's actually the next one on the list. This is fine, right? This is just fine. She's really cool, don't get me wrong. I think she's really cool, and what she does is really neat. I love cats. Who doesn't love dragons? But she just doesn't do enough. She hits someone, they sacrifice a creature, if they can. If they can't, you get a 3/3, and then Nekoru dies. Sorry, Wasitora dies. Yeah, that just doesn't seem good. That just isn't, like, compared to all of your other cards, this just seems kind of fine. You might get them to sacrifice a token, but you probably won't attack that player, so that's usually fine. But still, this seems just kind of okay, and I'm not too impressed. I don't want to talk too much about it. I just think it's kind of unimpressive compared to a lot of your other targets. Likewise, Gruff Triplets feels a little strange to me. The power is really there, but I think you have to keep finding ways to blink this creature or keep reanimating this creature. Only then do you really get the ability to do much. Because when you, so you blitz out Gruff Triplets, right? So you get 2 3/3s and then you have a 3/3 with haste at the end of the turn. Then it's going to attack someone, and then when it dies, it's going to turn those 3/3s into 6/6s. Maybe it's just me, that just doesn't feel very good, right? It's you're kind of 2 6/6s where one of them dies, the other one is going to be a 12/12, is just fine, I think. Like, the fact that they have trample, I will admit, kind of pushes them over the edge for me, but it pushes them into the edge of fine as opposed to good in a deck like this. If you had blink or a lot of reanimation, I would probably be a lot less picky about this card, because this card, once you play it the second time, it's really, really good. And you do have some reanimation, but generally I think you'll be happier to reanimate other targets, because this card needs a lot of, it needs a lot of love for it to be good. In certain setups, it's going to be really, really cool over a few turns, because once again, only the original gets the haste. So the other creatures are going to just be 3/3s with trample. Like, that's it. And then it's just gonna die. And then, like, yeah, eventually if you reanimate it and that dies again, you now have 2 6s, two 6/6s and 2 9/9s, and then one of those dies, the other two go. Like, that's cool, but that's so much work. And my goodness, is this card so weak to a board clear. So weak. It just absolutely does nothing if you get board clear. You basically cycle it, right? Because you draw a card off of it dying, and that's it. So if you play this, you hit someone for 3, they probably block with a 4/4, you say you're fine, you get 2 6s, and then someone wipes the board. You've kind of just wasted your turn. So I really, really don't like this. I think in other shells, this could be really cool, but even then, it's just really, it's really like direct into a board clear, and is not progressing your kind of, your resources otherwise. It's not drawing you cards, really. It's not giving you lands. It's really good at combat, and only that. But I do think it's cool, so I do respect it, and maybe just not in this deck. All right, how about some non-creature cards? I have 3 more cards to look at. Riveteer's Charm just feels weak here. That's it. That's the whole idea. Outside of its second mode, the other one only targets one opponent, so I don't particularly like it, whereas we can definitely have cards of the same type that force each opponent to sacrifice a creature, and that's just a better version of the first mode. The second mode is fine, but you're not the kind of deck to really use impulsive draw, mainly because a lot of your cards are really high mana. So if you flip the top 3 cards, there's a high chance you have upwards of, like, I don't know, I'm going to say 8 or 8 to 10 mana in those 3 cards, and then you just won't be able to use them all. So you're kind of wasting a potential card draw when you use a card like this. So I don't particularly like it. I just don't think it belongs here. It is on theme, I get that, but if we're making cuts, this is a card that needs to be cut. Finally, I have a bit of two cards that are a bit more controversial to what I like, which are 2 of our Feign Death effects. Right now we have 4. We have Feign Death, we have Not Dead After All, Supernatural Stamina, and Undying Evil. So, I find 4 of these a bit much. Now, what I usually like in Feign Death effects is a deck like this does make sense, right? We have a lot of sacrifice abilities, and we have Blitz that is a sacrifice ability to itself after a certain point, and and like I said, we have sacrifice outlets. So Feign Death already starts being a good card, and then when we have a way to protect our commander with something like this, we're going to be particularly happy with Feign Death. So that much I do get, but the problem is twofold. The first problem is that it is a bit clunky to use a sacrifice that is 100% triggered, right? What I mean by that is an activated ability sacrifice like Carrion Feeder has a lot of utility to it. You can cast Feign Death on something and then sacrifice it after the fact, which technically means Feign Death can be cast anytime. Or casting Feign Death in response to, like, Terminate is really, really good because you are ahead of the mana that's being spent and you're reactively using the spell, which means they'll need another card to stop it from happening. However, when we use it off of the Blitz trigger, it gets a little tricky because when the Blitz trigger is happening, it only happens in a specific phase or, through combat something is dying. And when you are casting the Feign Death, it is like an additional card from you with no other effects off of anyone else. So if someone does have that Terminate After All, or even worse, something like Swords to Plowshares, they're in a really, really good spot to use it against your creature because not only are they preventing, like Swords of Plowshares especially, not only are they preventing you from having the natural draw of Blitz, but they're actually stopping you from getting that creature back and wasting the Feign Death effect that you've just cast. It's just really a huge incentive for them to act when you use Feign Death around Blitz effects. Of course, the other thing, which I haven't said yet, but is I think a little obvious, is that it's another mechanic in our deck that is kind of reliant on Blitz, so we're just putting more eggs into that basket. I don't think wholly, because these cards are just rather good anyways, so you're not completely out by playing them, which is why I'm suggesting taking 2 of the 4 out. The ones that stick out as weaker are Supernatural Stamina and Undying Evil. Supernatural Stamina brings the creature back with no additional benefit when it's back, no +1/+1 counters, so to me it's generally the weakest one and is easy to cut. Undying Evil, on the other hand, is really specific that it only works when a creature doesn't have a +1/+1 counter, right? It doesn't give the Feign Death effect, it gives Undying. So not only does that mean it doesn't work with a creature that's already been Feign Death, which is a pretty specific outcome, but it also means it doesn't work with things like, where is it? Rampant Rejuvenator. It's a specific kind of, like, it's a corner case, don't get me wrong. I don't know how, I'd have to look through again to see if there's other creatures with +1/+1 abilities, but that's the main one. And that's also another corner case, but it does make it the second weakest, the second weakest Feign Death effect. So just because of that, those are the 2 I would cut, because they're just the weaker ones. Okay, so those are my cuts. Oh, we're at 41 minutes. I wanted to talk really quickly about ratios, but I think that's kind of a bigger question. The ratios look good. This is the shorthand. The ratios look good. Part of the reason I kind of left this to the end is because the ratios look good. It's not something that I'm worried about. Everything looks kind of fine. You're playing, 10 plus ramp cards in a deck that is aiming to cast big creatures. Half of your ramp is on creatures that you're happy to blitz out, so they're on theme and they provide utility, which is nice. So ramp is good. Card draw is based off half of your blitz, half of things like Painful Truths, Greater Good, Garrick's Uprising. Yep, you have a lot of variety in the kinds of card draw. Like some of it's based off of just casting Painful Truths, some of it's just, off of sacrificing creatures, and a lot of it is just off blitzing naturally. So I do like it here as well. And removal as well is the same thing. You've got board clears, you've got terminates, you've got beast withins, you hit a lot of different things. I'm generally very, very happy with the ratios. This is kind of a bigger question because the answer does somewhat depend on what your play group is and what your level of comfort is, because I like having a lot of removal, but some people like having less removal. I tend to give people less removal than I would personally run, but that's because I really, really like removal, and therefore I'm trying to kind of accommodate that. So what I would suggest, and what you are doing here, and I'm really happy with, is when it comes to removal, ramp, card draw, variety is king. You want a lot of different ways to do things. In Commander, people tend to run cards that are just basically shut down one strategy or one direction of interaction. And so having a bunch of them, such as board clears, sacrifice effects, and exile and destroy, makes it so that no matter what, somewhere in your deck, you have a method to deal with the cards that are on board. Okay, I hope that was helpful. I'm really, really happy with the deck. I think it looks really, really nice. With the cuts, I hope you can get the Blossoming Tortoise, because I think that's going to be really, really good in your deck. But even if you don't, the deck looks really, really solid. It looks at a really appropriate level for an upgraded pre-con, where you're not oppressive, you are playing your own game plan, and once that game plan gets going by turn 4 or 5, you're getting really far ahead and you're becoming a threat that your opponents have to care about. And I think that's a really, really, a very decent or a very acceptable level of a post-pre-con deck, one that cares very much so of its own game plan and takes a little while to get into it, but once it gets into it, it's doing exactly what it wants to do. And I think this deck is going to succeed at that quite a bit. I'd be very interested to see what the other decks your friends have picked up, or your play group has picked up that they are upgrading, because I'd like to see what's coming up to compete against a deck like this, and interesting in kind of the pod that you're making. I wonder if it's all new Capenna or a bunch of different decks. I think this is a really fun idea. It's one I've talked about with friends, but I've never sat down and done it because it does take a bit of energy to do so and money, but it is fun because you tend to end up with a bunch of decks that play really well with each other. And if the idea is that you're doing this together, a deck that becomes too strong can be adjusted to be kept in line with the others, and all of a sudden you have like a battle box of decks to play against each other, and I really like that. I hope this video was helpful to you. I'd really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe, and if you have another draft of this deck, you can send it through with the link in the video description below, and you can bring your deck to the front of the line with another link in the video description below. Thank you so much again, Adam. I really do appreciate you supporting the channel. It means a lot, and I hope to see, I hope to hear from you on how this deck plays. I think this is a good spot, and before we go to more drafts, I think it's a great time to start trying it out and see if you like it. Not saying don't send more drafts. You can always send more drafts, but I think we're into the next phase of seeing how it performs in the pod and then adjusting from that point on. All right, we're almost at an hour. I'm gonna let this go now. All right, good luck.